Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a nice lunch. And now I'm happy to open the session, The Impact of Geopolitics and Legislation on the Jewelry Trade. And I call on stage the moderator, Avi Kravitz, please, and the participants, Ferial Zerouki, Raluca Engel, Sarah Yud, Karen Rentmeister, Edward Asher.
On. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. After a delicious lunch, we are ready for some more food for thought. And today's panel, in fact, both panels we have this afternoon, this one being on the impact that geopolitics has on the jewelry industry, and the second one later this afternoon being the diamond industry at a crossroads. I'm hoping will force us to think strategically. And one of the beauties and really achievements, I think, of CIBJO is that it very quietly and effectively thinks about the industry on a micro level, from a strategic point of view. You know, I think that's the idea behind the Blue Book, for example. And it's very easy for us to get caught up in the nitty-gritty and technical aspects of what's happening in the industry. So as was mentioned, my name is Avi Kravitz. I'm the founder and publisher of the Diamond Press. I've been in the industry for coming on 2 decades now, and I have a bit of a confession to make to you. When it comes to geopolitics, I tended, in my early years at least, to sort of deal with it as a peripheral issue, that there are these internal and there's these internal things going on in the industry, and those are the main factors that are shaping the market. But then we've had these external sort of shocks that have reminded us of the impact that outside influences can have on us. You know, the 2008 financial crisis being one of them, and that brought a heightened regulatory environment from a financial point of view, how we deal with our finances and reporting in the industry. And then COVID, the pandemic in 2020 was another shock event for us. But the last 5 years have been a little different and brought us to another level in terms of how we have to relate to geopolitical issues affecting the industry. That we have this constant geopolitical environment and regulatory practice that is really having a marked influence on how the diamond and jewelry industry operates. And so our aim today with this incredibly talented and somewhat intimidating panel of experts, all the women and Edward to help me out, is to think strategically, but also to understand how these events are and the issues are affecting the industry. And we're going to deal with 3 main issues. The first being the US trade policy and the effect that the tariffs in the United States for imports to the US are having on the industry. The second issue will be the import restrictions on Russian goods, Russian diamonds, which has kind of fallen into the shadows of the industry conversation, but is certainly still very relevant. And then we have some very important ESG regulations coming into the European Union, and that forces us to figure out how the diamond and jewelry industry relates to ESG and sustainability and all these issues. So I'm going to start with firstly introducing our panel again and giving you a bit of their credentials. Firstly, we have. We'll start at the end with the gentleman. We have Edward Asher, who I don't think is any stranger to anyone. Edward is the vice chairman of the Responsible Jewellery Council. Raluca Engel is the head of external affairs and industry relations at the Natural Diamond Council. Sarah Yude is the CEO and general counsel at the Jewelers Vigilance Committee. Feriel Zerouki is the chief trade and industry officer at De Beers and the president of the World Diamond Council. And Karen Rentmeester is the CEO of the Antwerp World Diamond Center. So, when we'll deal with the issue of tariffs first, and there's been there's still this sort of lingering expectation, and Feriel, I'll direct my first question to you, that there is a possibility or a pending development that there will be a universal exemption for diamonds with regard to the U.S. tariffs and imports to the United States. Where do we stand in that discussion? Is that still a possibility for the industry?
Well, thank you very much, Avi. And it's a great question to start with and very relevant to this moment in time. The quick answer is yes, that is the hope, and that is the target. That is what we are lobbying towards. And the why is because that's where we started. So before the notion of tariffs being an issue for our trade, we started at zero. And there was a reason for that. The United States of America is the largest consumer market. The product is not one that is produced in the United States, so there's no local market to protect, local production to protect. But it feeds in, it's an ingredient product that feeds into a very growing market of manufacturing, homegrown American manufacturers in the United States that are feeding into this consumer base. And so you don't have really a disconnect between the trade in the US and the rest of the world here. We're both asking for the same thing because it just makes sense, and it makes sense to the US. The way it is imposed right now, we're calling it a consumer tax. And which consumer is actually going to be impacted? Well, the American consumer, not just the trade, because we're going to pass that cost on. The second point to make is there are consumers everywhere else in the world, right, that won't need to bear this consumer tax. And so it negatively impacts the United States here. So we think that there's logic to our madness as we continue to lobby. But it's been difficult. So one of the reasons why it's been difficult is that this is not a diamond-only problem. It is a problem that impacts all products. And so to get your foot into the door and get access with the right people at the right levels in government has been very difficult. Usually when we're lobbying, it's quite specific. It's towards a policy that's going to be imposed on our product. So it makes sense. We've got more access. We've got more time. But here we're fighting against other industries, all saying that they're different, and here's why. So that's the reason why it's been difficult. But the hope is the same, and the target's still the same.
Well, Sarah, is the approach, is the correct approach for the industry to lobby Washington, or is it, because it doesn't seem that the administration is negotiating with industry? So again, sort of the same question, but what is the, I want to manage the industry's expectations in this regard.
I would say that it's a yes and situation. So yes, of course, it's important to be lobbying Washington. They are ultimately the ones who are deciding policy. And to be clear, it's actually truly only one person who's deciding this policy. But I think that also because of the pathway that we've been given by Annex 3, so Annex 3 is the list of goods, including diamonds and colored gemstones and natural pearls, that might be eligible for a tariff exemption under, the structures. This is an option and a pathway forward. So what's actually quite important, in addition to talking to Washington, is talking to individual countries' own governments to get them to prioritize Annex 3 in their trade negotiations with the United States. So that means that, we've seen that now with the EU, finalizing their trade deal and gaining those access to Annex 3. Annex 3 is not just about jewelry. There's a lot of other products on the list, including coffee and tea and saffron and kiwis and other goods that do not exist in the United States. And so getting your own country to advocate for access to Annex 3 will be very important.
Okay, and Karen, the European Union, I think famously now, has become the benchmark in these negotiations, having secured that zero tariff for diamonds being included in that Annex 3. Can you talk a bit about the AWDC role, in advocating for the product to be included in those negotiations?
Well, I think my two predecessors here have sort of summarized it perfectly. There was the WDC and working with all the other organizations actually setting the narrative. We're talking about a mineral that is not available in the US. We're not talking about reshoring something that isn't there. And what Sarah said, I want to say it's never been about the diamonds. I think we felt very early on that both on a European side, Belgian government side, but also on the US government side or administration side, is that everyone realized that it's not about the diamonds. And to your point, diamonds have always been a strategic asset, used. Second World War, the diamonds were brought out of Antwerp before the Germans when they were invading the country because it's a strategic asset. It's a pawn in a chess game that administrations use in the trade negotiations. And I think what is important is it could have been us, it could have been India, it could have been Israel, it could have been any country that said, let's try and break through this barrier. I'm obviously happy that we succeeded in doing that, and how we did it is using those ingredients that were just laid out and doing it on a 24/7 constant non-stop basis. Talking to your own administration, to your own governments, in our case, European Union was very important. First milestone was making sure that diamonds didn't appear on a retaliatory list. Because obviously if we would be on a retaliatory list, then the US would say, oh, well, we're not going to give them an exemption. That was the first sort of hurdle. And then working continuously on making those points clear. And saying, there's nothing to gain, making sure that you're in the top 10 of that list of all the member states. Portugal wanted cork on the list. Every country has a list of hundreds of products they want on that list. So it's a continuous effort, and I think it's a fight worth fighting and continuing to fight. And I hope India has good news soon, and I hope Israel has good news soon, and I hope that Botswana and Namibia have good news soon. But the key will be a bilateral agreement.
Right. Well, you sort of preempted my follow-up question to you, because we don't have representatives from India, from Botswana, Namibia. These are countries where diamonds are very much a strategic asset. And do you have any insights, perhaps, given your experience, are working with these centres to advance their cause? What is where does Botswana and India stand in their engagement with their respective governments?
Well, I think in this administration, in the negotiations with the US, it's a give and take game. What do you have in your country? I think everybody understands by now that rare earth minerals are high on the wish list of the US administration. So it's going to have to be a give and take. And I think everybody understands the narrative, and that was really good to do, but it's going to be a bilateral negotiation like you have any other negotiation. And I think all those countries that you've mentioned have a lot to offer. And I think in the perspective of geopolitical tensions, probably countries like Botswana and Namibia have a little bit of a head start compared to, for example, in India. But I think it's worthwhile for all of them to keep fighting. And like I said, it has to be done on a continuous basis.
I mean, it certainly gives us encouragement, the European experience, that that there will be a broader adoption of these zero tariffs. Edward, I'd like to turn to you, and if you could put on your commercial trading hat for a minute, and maybe talk about the impact that tariffs are having on within the trade, you know, in terms of business operations. If you don't mind.
Thank you, Avi. Of course, it has an enormous impact on all of us if we do business in the United States, and most of us do business all over the world. And what I see in my own company, where my children are now leading, is that not only we try to continue to export, we also are looking for other markets. That's of course that everybody else is doing, or trying to find ways to get your goods in a legal way, but efficient way in the United States of America. That's difficult. But let's look at the big picture. And the big picture is that we live now in a decennium of uncertainty. That what we discussed here too, for instance, in Shanghai, and in Jaipur, in these conferences, was about sustainability and ESG, and on this side were the preachers, and on that side were the converted. That has been changed. Not that you have changed or we have changed. What has changed is the outside world. I've never seen in my life such drastic changes in such a short time. I said it is the decennium of uncertainty. It's not the past 5 years, it's the next 10 years. So we have to be very flexible and very creative. But my feeling is what is happening today has a very negative influence on the goals that we stand for and that we are here together. And probably I'll get to that back later.
Yeah, we certainly will address the ESG components, and I think, you know, all these three issues that we're dealing with today have a common thread. You know, that forces the industry to be more accountable, for their diamonds and jewelry products, and also accountable for who you do business with. But, you know, not to spoil the punchline, Sarah, I want to return to you if you don't mind. You know, the idea behind the tariffs is to encourage manufacturing in the United States, to level the playing field in terms of the tariffs that are charged in and out of the United States and other countries, where I think it's fair to say that the diamond industry has not been on that level playing field with, you know, various taxes for many years. In various jurisdictions. So can you talk a bit about the impact that the tariffs have had on the jewelry sector in the United States, you know, and I think particularly on the manufacturing side?
Certainly. So one of the fast areas of interest after the tariffs went into place were, okay, how do we get around this? How do we use these to our advantage? Just a lot of questions about manufacturing and locations. So something that's incredibly important to remember is the concept of substantial transformation. So if you mine a diamond in Botswana, for example, and then you send it to India for cutting and polishing, it becomes a product of India. And so the India tariff applies even though that diamond originated in Botswana. In terms of precious metal, the place of casting is often the country of origin, or most likely the country of origin. So there are some businesses in the United States who have decided, okay, the way that we can do this is casting our jewelry in the United States, sending it abroad for setting, and then re-importing it back. It's still a product of the United States because setting does not change the country of origin. So there has been a focus on these types of pathways for creating jewelry in the U.S. and continuing to rely on U.S. manufacturing while looking at these, potential advantages elsewhere. We've also seen a pathway through Mexico because of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, the inheritor of the NAFTA agreement, which is essentially allows for free trade between the US, Canada, and Mexico. There are some diamonds being imported to Mexico, being put into settings cast in Mexico and then imported into the US. So businesses are exploring these various pathways. Of course, it's a huge disruptor to the traditional industry, and it doesn't solve the problem of the fact that India trade is completely, cut off right now at a 50% tariff. It's really harming the industry elsewhere. I'll also note that I think that there are, potentially some really interesting pathways. So for, color gemstones that are mined in, let's say, Kenya or Tanzania, where they have a 10% tariff rate right now, it might actually be quite advantageous to cut them in country and then import them to the US because you'll avoid a larger tariff somewhere else. So I think for a long time, as the tariffs were being put into place and the rates were fluctuating, businesses were really reluctant to make a lot of changes to their supply chain because it just felt unreliable to do so. And as things are starting to slowly settle out, you might see more US businesses adding to their supply chain, adding suppliers, moving things around.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I would imagine that that maybe it's almost too soon to tell, the longer term impact that it might have on the trade dynamic. Karen, the knee-jerk reaction would be to say that Antwerp is in an advantageous position right now, and that there would be a shift of goods, of work into Antwerp. So very briefly, because we need to move on, but is that happening?
Well, I think it's like you said, it's too soon to say. Now, obviously, our workforce in terms of polishing is not as large as India, not by, we're not at the same level. So it's not possible to, and it's a little bit what Sarah said, you can't just move an entire industry overnight. What we do see is what Sarah highlights. People are looking at ways, and there are, people who are asking the questions, especially US. Think of buying groups, etc. Say, who can we get in touch with, can supply us with European-made diamonds? So we can facilitate those things, but things don't change overnight. You do see that people can react very fast when it comes to moving goods. The manufacturing part is a different story.
Okay, and Raluca, given your position, you have a good eye and an overview of the consumer space. What is the sentiment in terms of the consumer and how they're relating to these this tariff discussion, and especially as we head into the holiday season now?
Consumers are certainly not part of this conversation in this moment. And Ferial hinted at it. They will need to pay the price in America. It's something where they might be feeling, but they're certainly not in line with this. And you don't want them to. This is something that even us here on the stage, of course, it's important to be part of the conversation as an industry to contribute and to have this representation, which is you have it at all the levels. But fundamentally, these are decisions that are out of our hands. And I would just caution one element, and that's permanence. We have no idea for how long these systems will actually be set in place. So definitely, I would say from history, more cautious, just wait and realize afterwards what the impact is important, especially you're speaking about manufacturing. These are big moves to make. So there I would wait for a bit longer for the dust to settle. But consumers, they will see the impact on prices, which is why it's very important them going extremely positive, in love with their pieces of jewelry, and them already having made the decision what to buy for the holiday season. And that's something with the NDC, we're there next to them.
Absolutely, and it does feel like very much an industry discussion, and it shouldn't enter the industry lexicon. But I think what does bring it closer to the consumer is, as you know, Sarah mentioned, that the tariffs are centered around source, substantial transformation, whereas the industry discussion has very much been focused on origin in the last year or so, and particularly driven by the restrictions on Russian imports and the sanctions on Russian diamond entities, etc., and that's forced the industry to look at the origin of diamond, which being, you know, bringing it back to the rough source of the polished stone. And so, Sarah, maybe you can comment on this. You know, how much of a differentiation is made at the customs level? You know, you have a customs officer who's dealing with diamond imports, and they're being asked to look at source for tariffs and origin for in terms of the sanctions. Is there such a clear distinction that's made at that level?
Well, right now, the customs officer's big problem is that they're not getting paid. So that might be problem number one. But
it's a good start.
Problem number two is that, this information, the information on origin and then actual country, so like country of mining and then country of origin, is not necessarily submitted to them. So what they're seeing is country of origin in our idea for polished diamonds, where the diamonds were cut and polished. There was a potential effort on the customs side to capture this information, but it's been long delayed. And this is all sort of part of this work that the G7, had been doing for, trying to introduce this sort of more traceability on diamonds. On the U.S. side, obviously, we've had a significant change in administration since that work began, and there's been a lot less emphasis on that from the U.S. government. And I should clarify that despite the color that I'm wearing, I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, but it does show that I think their priorities have shifted. One thing I will say is that there were these two, what we call general licenses from the Treasury Department that essentially allowed the trade in sort of legacy diamonds and jewelry that existed from Russia before the import bans. And the U.S. license on loose diamonds was set to expire September 1. It was only put in for 1 year. And JVC, along with government affairs folks from De Beers, worked really hard to get the U.S. industry to renew that license for another year, which they have done, which to me was actually quite a relief, because it meant that somebody somewhere thought that the sanctions and the import restrictions were still important. So that was a good indicator that there's something there.
Okay. In terms of what's required of the trade, Ferial, the WDC was, I think from the beginning, quite a vocal advocate of a sort of a self-declaration mechanism. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that is what's basically in place, certainly in the United States and various other G7 countries. And so, what's involved in self-declaration? There's kind of a feeling that it's the easier route to say a blockchain-based proof of origin. Is that a misconception?
So that is wrong, because I would agree with you, a self-declaration isn't right? That's why that's not what the WDC was lobbying for. But there was a massive miscommunication campaign against the WDC, and it was very hard to fight. So let me take you back. First, there were sanctions, and everyone was absolutely fine. Great. Sanctions are targeted. They're about a business or individuals or a country. Then there were import restrictions, and the trade was mixing the two. And I was getting highly frustrated during that time, because sanctions are applied to them, and import restrictions apply to us, right? So if something is coming our way that applies to us, surely we must have a voice in the matter. And I had two hats. I had De Beers, the largest producer, and the WDC representing the entire trade that would be impacted by these import restrictions. And so a position of De Beers could have been, yes, blockchain traceability, because that's exactly what we're doing, right? But when you're representing the trade as the WDC, you need to represent everybody, large players all the way through to small players. And so we developed a solution at the request of the G7 Technical Committee to submit to the G7 Technical Committee. It had 3 layers. It had the layer for the big players, the ones that could apply technology for traceability, the ones that could have access to the heavy equipment that requires scanning to put your diamonds on a blockchain. You just don't, because to be honest with you, you can do blockchain self-declaration. You just submit a self-declaration into a blockchain. Same difference. So you need real equipment to be able, at source, to be able to register a product at source and continue that journey on the blockchain to make it credible. That's number one. So we had that high level. We had the level of those that have access to things like RJC membership. RJC membership has a provenance claims section where your management systems are audited to make sure that you are keeping your goods segregated. That's not a self-declaration. That is a third-party audit from a third-party verifier. Then you had the third level. The third level is for those small players or the informal sector, because we don't like to leave artisanal miners behind. I certainly don't. I don't like leaving the informal sector behind. Just because they don't have access to these tools does not mean that we need to exclude them from a very important trade. Their production is important and it supports millions of livelihoods. So those were the 3 levels that we submitted in terms of not what you government need to do to us, but rather, hey government, this is what we as an industry can do, from the large players to the small players. So you create the guidelines and this is what we can comply with right now. It was honest. And there was a massive miscommunication campaign. I think we were, it was all sort of summarized as a self-declaration. I tried to clarify it in every platform and every article, but it just did not land. And so that discrepancy was created within, I guess, what we saw coming out of government. Some governments within the G7 listened, other governments didn't. And what we face now is not good for anyone in the trade, because we have a G7 all with different policies. We are businesses and we want the same policy, and we're trying to do good. So how can you run a global business where you need to comply with a specific thing in Europe and something totally different in the US and something totally different in Japan? It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, well, it does seem that at the moment, Karen, that Europe is the outlier, that there is still a program, or understood to be a program, to bring in a blockchain-based proof of origin, and with a deadline of January 1st. And again, perhaps my assumptions are wrong, so you're welcome to correct me, but what can we expect from the EU on January 1st, when the next sanctions package comes into effect? And then maybe you can follow on from what Feriel spoke about in terms of bringing a standardized sort of effort across those G7 countries.
Yeah, I think first to clarify, I mean, we have the 16th sanction package, which only applies to EU, Belgium being part of the EU, France, Italy, etc. So this concerns a lot of people who are here in the room today. The 16th sanction package, just to be very clear, because I've been reading those texts over and over, I almost can say them by heart. There's no such thing in the text of the 16th package saying blockchain-based, none. It says traceability-based evidence. Certification.
I stand corrected.
No, but it's just because it's been, I mean, this has been, like Feriel said, much of the talk has been, there's going to be a system and it's going to be a fully traceable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, I think what is important, what will happen on January 1st, I am not a politician. I'm not leading the conversations. We're obviously trying to get as much information like any one of us from our government and from the European Commission. It's being discussed as we speak. I'm pretty sure of that. And one thing that I do want to highlight is what we've been stressing together, because I think we have learned a lot from our mistakes. I'm not too shy to say that mistakes were made in the past. We've done a lot of consultation. A big thank you and shout out to CIBJO, Laurence, Leo. I mean, I see all of you here, Feriel, the WDC. We've done a lot of consultation, speaking to everyone and trying to find that sort of common thread. And I think we're landing very close to what Feriel described. There's no one size fits all. And the most important thing of all is you need to have some kind of a standard. You need to have some kind of a vision on what traceability is and what it isn't. Because honestly, we've spoken in our backyard, we've spoken to hundreds of companies, and I can tell you I heard 100 different definitions of traceability. And I hate to burst anyone's bubble, but some of those are not traceability. So I think it's important. I mean, this is the sort of balance between regulator and industry. And I fully agree with what Feriel said is, from an industry perspective, the last thing you want is a government to tell you what to do, especially if it's a government that doesn't know what you do. And so rather than waiting for governments to tell you what to do and put things on you that are so far from realities on the ground, the idea is that you work with organizations like an RGC, a WDC, a CIBJO, setting standards and work with those standards and then say to a government, this is what we can deliver. And it's going to be, this is going to be a work in progress. Anyone who thinks that you can implement traceability overnight is delusional. So I think those are the points that I think I want to make. I know time is ticking. For all of us here in Europe, time is ticking. So we all hope with you that we can get clarification on what will happen on January 1st. And I mean, I think like all of you, we have done our very best to make it very clear to governments what is possible and what is not possible, what is a dream, what is a long-term project, and what can be done in the short term.
Thank you, Karen. And I think you know, that question of what is traceability, you know, brings us into definitions, which is beyond the scope of this panel, but I assume it will be discussed tomorrow when many of the same panelists reconvene for the discussion on the Blue Book. But Raluca, you know, it does speak to a sort of a. We have two types of governmental relationships at the moment. You know, there is Europe, which feels like it's highly regulated or relatively highly regulated, and then as Sarah alluded to, you know, the current American administration is less engaged in these issues. And we can include the ESG components in this part of the discussion, you know. And so, you know, how does it affect the general industry dynamic? And you know, given your personal background, having worked in that European Union regulatory environment, you know, how do they look at industry and the jewelry industry, perhaps, if you have that experience? You know, you know, is there that we see that disconnect between what industry needs and what regulators want?
I can definitely confirm that they are not looking at the jewelry sector. And the reason for which they are not doing that is that, especially if you're looking at the European Union, Sarah, you are also making this point, you're being thrown in the same pot with a lot of other topics, which is why it's very important that a lot of initiatives actually come from us. A lot of self-regulation from the industry is something that can set such an important tone, show a lot of leadership, and absolutely preempt legislation that you might not need. Now, on the legislation that you have out there, certainly the European Union has taken it as top priority. Have a greener European Union, and definitely also partners that the European Union has, but also protecting consumers. So a lot of their legislation that was set up in the previous legislature, but also in the current one, has put consumer at the center, whether it's ESG, the greening of the agenda, or on consumer protection. And I wanted to just make a point with the previous topic that you had that applies to this. What's important is consumers are not they are not connected with these topics, and they have not asked any questions on sanctions. We have not seen any changes of behaviors from their perspective. But what they definitely need to know is the fact that industry has responded immediately to any request the legislators have had. So I would like to highlight that it's one of the key industries to respond positively and respond incredibly fast. And that's an element that is important to carry to consumers. Now on ESG, what the legislators have done, and I think in the US, new priorities have pushed more on the green sustainability related agenda on a different level. The legislators have actually educated and have started educating our consumers, because consumers will now expect certain things. Some might go in more details. The vast majority will not. They're purchasing, especially in our industry, they're purchasing their products more on emotional connections than they're looking at a different side of feelings and responses that our products can provide. But they would expect our industry to meet certain levels. And this is where you have that self-regulation of industry that can already come and meet those expectations.
Yeah, and the question of what is motivating, ethical sourcing is one I'll come back to. But first, Edward, we can, from the answers and the discussion so far, we feel this tension between the industry having to respond to regulatory directives and the industry's own initiatives, and that being the driving force behind all the responsible sourcing efforts that we're engaged in. From an RJC perspective, how do you stay ahead of the curve? How do you stay ahead of the of those sort of regulatory expectations?
Thanks from the RJC. If you look at the supply chain, what is missing at the moment is colored stones. And that's the most complicated part of the supply chain. And in the RJC, we are now in the strategic task force of the RJ looking how can we include colored stones in the future and make sure that there is a responsible supply chain in colored stones. The problem there is colored stones, of course, come from all over the world, all countries. It's very complicated. The second, we are seriously looking into it, and the RJC is a standard organization, so once we have developed a draft, we will consult it with everybody before we go any further. And the second part I wanted to say is, continuing from what I said at the first instance, that although we as organizations in the industry are moving ahead, in reality, governments are doing a step backwards. And that is, this is a geopolitical forum. If you look at politics, you can look at the European Parliament. It's not only in the USA, it is in various countries that we see there's a strong development of putting on the brakes. I think here there is a very important direction for the people here around us in the industry, is that the time for complacency, where we thought we were doing the right thing, is over. The governments are now lacking, and we have to see if we can influence the governments. On the other hand, why are governments putting on the brakes? It's on the request of industries. It has to be cost effective. It has to be doable. And that is something that we, and I know Karen is, and Feria are very strong in that. That's what we have to influence our governments all over the world, that the measures that we take to protect the environment, ESG, human rights, DEI, all these things that are dear to us, that they do it in such a way that it is efficient and that's effective.
It's a lovely twist on the way I've been thinking about it, and so I thank you for that, because if governments have reduced their sort of interest, let's say, on particularly sustainability issues. And the industry is showing a keen interest to lead the conversation at that level. I think it shows a greater engagement with consumers. And the argument is always that consumers aren't coming in en masse asking for ethically sourced diamonds. But there is an understanding, I think, in the industry that it's expected of them. And so maybe we can, in the last 10 minutes of this discussion, discuss, and starting with you, Edward, given the many hats that you wear, and your vast experience, what is really motivating this drive towards ethical sourcing?
For me personally, that's very clear. We sell a product, whether it is diamond, colored stones, or jewelry, at a happy occasion. It's always to celebrate something. It's emotional. We cannot have a product where negative emotional feelings about whatever it is, the environment, human rights, DEI, is connected with our product. So it is essential for the survival of a luxury industry that our product is fulfilling all the demands that we discuss here and that are dear to our heart. So that is what makes me tick, that we have to make sure that our product is 100%, even if it is not demanded by governments or others, it is demanded by us.
And I'll give you each an opportunity to address that, but I do want to just take a step back quickly, because there is also the sort of industry side of things and the way and the systems that we have in place, and there's a sense that the way the Kimberley process, for example, or frankly the RJC does its audits is not as up to date or tech savvy that it might be. So, Ferial, I know there's an effort to digitize the Kimberley process certificates, and maybe you can give us a brief update on that, and also talk to us a bit about the significance of it and how it plays into that broader consumer discussion.
Yeah, so I think the Kimberley process is such a strong tool, and I just don't know why the trade isn't so thankful and so positive about it. It doesn't exist for any other product, right? We have the access to 86 governments, and when a decision is made, it's applied into law in those 86 countries, right? So when we try and make a decision in a business, it takes forever. Here at the KP, we have a plan. Every plenary, we can make a decision. Okay, there is a veto mechanism, so if one country's vetoes, it stops the whole decision. It doesn't stop the work, right? And as Bernadette said in her speech, it is voted number one mechanism for embedding regulation in countries. So I just thought, I don't know why often it's people that don't understand it and don't have access to it. So please get to know the Kimberley process. Now, does it need reform? Yes. Is it perfect? No. I'm the last one to say that the Kimberley process is perfect. But nothing is, as I mentioned earlier, nothing is perfect. But it's got the tools to create huge impact. In the reform and review year, we made so much changes. One is to move towards the digitization of the entire process, which means we will get access to global statistical data in real time once this happens, meaning we will know where diamonds are being produced, exported, imported, etc., real time, globally. The type of analysis that gives you access to is unbelievable. Which other product can give you that? Also, it's made it really difficult for anyone to smuggle diamonds. If you smuggle diamonds and you get caught, you will be in trouble because of the Kimberley process. So the way I like to describe the KP, and I'm going to use some of the information I've put in my speech, so it's like a red light. Red, amber, green. It's not going to stop all of the accidental killings on the road, right? But because it doesn't stop all accidental killings on the road, doesn't mean you make a decision to remove the red lights from the roads. You're just going to create chaos if you do something like that. To continue improvement, you need speed humps. I call that the RJC. You need people that will measure, the police with speeds. Let's call that the system of warranties. We complement this mechanism that applies to government. So let's really champion it. I call on all of you to get to know it. On the RJC, when you grow, you get criticism. So well done, RJC, for getting criticism and being relevant. There's always place and time to improve.
Thank you, Ferial. And I guess the big question in that analysis of data is who the proverbial we is. As an analyst in the industry, I'm hoping that I'll have access to that. So we'll speak later.
Public and there's the private. Yeah. So the WDC members have access to the private.
Understood. Okay, so let's do a quick give you each a quick opportunity to answer that question, and then we'll maybe open it for one or two questions before we wrap up. But Raluca, again in the consumer space, this idea of diamond accountability that we're so focused on within the industry. How is it resonating with the industry? And maybe you can touch on the marketing element of it, and the messaging that we're giving to the consumer and how they're relating to that message.
Thank you, Avi. For the consumers, talking to them in a way that gets to their hearts is incredibly important. Very often on the topic of sustainability, organizations, not necessarily from this industry, but globally, consumers end up being preached at, and that is not something that they will learn from. So it's incredibly important that you get the great messaging in the right way to get to them. For us, it's been a formula that has been tried and tested very often, and we've seen a lot of our campaigns actually reaching these consumers because we end up sharing a lot of topics of interest for them, and we integrate them in the broader story around natural diamonds and natural diamond jewelry. For consumers, that's not the first question that they asked whenever they get to your stores or in your businesses. They're definitely interested and certainly attracted to the industry and these products for different reasons. But they do buy a luxury product. It's a product that they don't need. Therefore, them feeling good after their purchases is very important. And this is where this can be used as one in a marketing way, get to understand the consumers, get to share these messages. For various organizations, the reason for which you would be taking on or embedding ESG depends on your business, whether it's a family ethos, it's a karma you believe in, whether it's a response that you want to bring through to legislation. There are different reasons. Sharing that with consumers, doing it in an open manner and as simple as possible. It doesn't need to be too complicated, and they certainly don't need too many messages to get this message across.
Thank you, and I think we'll give the final word to Sarah, if you don't mind, because I'm interested to hear from the U.S. jewelry perspective, the U.S. jeweler perspective, if they're recognizing that and engaging with, particularly, I think, ESG messaging and verification and accountability in the same way that we talk about it within our trade circles.
Certainly. I think some businesses are, and many are not. Certainly, the lack of emphasis on this from the current administration in the United States makes many think, okay, I thought I had to pay attention to that, and now I don't. What we're actually encouraging JVC members to do is to look to the EU, to look to other countries that are focusing on this and as a roadmap, as a pathway for moving forward. There are plenty of businesses that want to do better in the supply chain, whether that's because of an ethical belief or it's because they know that the reputation of the jewelry industry depends on it. And without guidance from our government, where do we go? Okay, let's look to what other governments are doing. And so we're encouraging JVC members to not stop an emphasis on this, despite the fact that the Federal Trade Commission Green Guide's review seems stuck in an open position forever, and that the U.S. government isn't focusing on that, and in fact is, rolling back things with the Environmental Protection Agency and all of that work. So, what can we do moving forward? We can continue to work together. The industry, the incredible thing about the jewelry industry is we are so interrelated and interdependent on everyone. The U.S. jewelry industry cannot act alone because we don't have many of the products that are sold in the industry. So in order to work together, in order to actually get supply for our industry, we have to be aligned. And so we hope that businesses will continue to prioritize this going forward, even though the U.S. administration is not going to make them do so.
Reluka, you want to add something?
Yes, Sarah used the word interdependence. That's absolutely it. It's the same supply chain. It's the same consumer at the end. So if legislation in some areas of the world affect a certain type of organization, so for example, from the EU, the ESG-related legislation definitely applies to the largest organizations, whether it's revenue or number of employees. However, a lot of us here in the room and as industry, we are part of the same supply chain, part of the same value chain, which means those organizations will come asking for information and what's important, proof. So having, for example, RGC certification membership, that's a proof that will be valid for them. It needs to be, of course, verifiable. The third-party verification is certainly not something to ignore as criteria, but it will give the opportunity for those organizations directly affected by this legislation to be able to count on very important, clean and transparent supply chain. So interconnectedness should not be ignored.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's a good message to end on. My takeaway is that there is a call for unity, without sounding too much of a cliche, but I think it's real. And one of the areas of unity is in the standardization of what's expected of the trade. And I think CIBJO has an interesting role to play in that. So I guess let's maybe, and I apologize, we're 5 minutes over time according to the clock, but I think we do have some leeway. Are there any burning questions from the audience that might be addressed to the panel?
You don't realize it, but we couldn't see you before. It was very dark.
If you have a question, you can raise your hand. Yes. Sorry, I don't see. There we go.
Good afternoon. Hello, hello. Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Ronnie Bow, Australia. You've been talking a lot about the G7 in this discussions, which is Europe. Now I can hear it. How do you make it broader for the G20, for countries outside of this, which are obviously also affected by the tariffs?
Farrell, you want to?
So with the G7, we've been engaging on the sanctions and on the import restrictions. On the tariffs, we've actually been working in unity under the WDC with the AWDC, with GJEPC in India, with all of our members, with Jewelers of America. We united with the World Federation of Diamond Bourses. Step number one was, let's agree on a industry position, because one way to really fail in this environment is if the industry gives different messages to the same administration. And so under the umbrella of the World Diamond Council, we all agreed on the key messages and the ask. And that's what we all then took. Within the membership of the WDC, we had access to, for example, the EU government or the Indian government. So the ask wasn't only for the US, it was also to lobby our own governments to make the reciprocal offer on diamonds ahead of their country or bilateral engagements. So there were two steps, well, three. One is agree on the message, and the ask. 3 is get your own government to offer the reciprocal same request. And then 4 was go to the US government with the support of the US trade to lobby. So everything was included for the latter, if that helps, for the tariffs.
Anyone else? Yes, Roberta. Yeah.
I would like to say that the 15% which we are paying in the United States, everybody in the world is going to pay that. So we all have the same problem.
The
So
15%. Yeah.
Yes. So don't get too worried about it, because we all have the same problem. You know, the market will not diminish as much as we think. We probably have to reduce some of the margin, everybody, but the market will carry on. So that is the positive part. The second part, which we are trying to test, is if we are using American gold. And if we are using American gold, do we get a debate? Of course, the customs, they don't have an answer. And we asked 3 customs, they don't have an answer. America, there has not written anything about how duty should be followed. But however, we will try harder and harder. So the only thing I can say, probably the EU should have negotiated better. So it's your fault, madam.
No, it's my fault. Yeah, I'll take the blame. It's okay. I just want to add one thing, Roberto, because I think you're pointing to something. There's obviously the distinction between jewelry and for us, loose diamonds being shipped, where we have a 0 exemption now. But I think one important thing, and we've been telling our constituents the same, and you've asked me the question also, origin when it comes to sanctions or tariffs, 2 different things or not? I think essentially it's not 2 different things, but there's a different incentive on the side of border control in the US. Tariffs bring in money. Sanctions don't change anything in terms of money coming in. And the biggest way for me to illustrate the difference is that last week we got a call from one of our shippers saying that there were 7 shipments in the past 3 weeks that were blocked by US Customs. And I've never known any in terms of sanctions being blocked on the US side, or I never was informed about it, but this I was informed about. And I got a list of things that needed to be provided. If you have manufactured this outside, and there's 5 items on the list, you need to have a proof of a bill that you had the polishing work done there in X, Y. If you do it in-house, you need to provide workflows. And you need to provide reports internally. I've never seen anything like that with sanctions. So there's a monetary incentive, even though they don't get paid, and I would not be motivated to do the job. But there is a monetary incentive on the side of border control today to really uphold certain restrictions. And lastly, I wanted to say, you asked the question, you know, is origin important, or is it like more of a regulatory thing or a marketing thing? I think it's both. Because if we want to tell the story about the beautiful countries our diamonds come from, you're going to have to talk about origin. And if you want to talk about origin in that sense, it's going to be the mining country of origin. If you want to tell the complete story, we're also going to say something about where it's polished and who polished it and why it's a craftsmanship and what the difference is between, you know, robots and, you know, people working on a polishing wheel. So I think it's always going to be a bit of both.
Sarah?
I should also mention that there is a Supreme Court case upcoming. The oral arguments will be held on November 5th, and that's a case about the tariffs specifically as they've been applied. And so it is possible that the Supreme Court could say that all of these tariffs were illegal and therefore you all get refunds. It is also possible that they say, nope, it's fine, and then we continue on this pathway. So I would also look to that as a potential inflection point.
Thank you. I think we'll call it a session at that. Just in response to Roberto's comments, you know, we haven't spoken about the impact that these things have on the market on a sort of micro level. But let that be a bit of a teaser, although we're not going to go into the geopolitical elements too much in the next session, but we are going to be talking about the diamond industry. So I think we're due for a coffee break, and we'll reconvene to discuss the diamond market with some equally talented panelists. So thank you, our panelists, for the discussion, and for all of you for listening.